Let's get rolling. So quick welcome to everyone for joining us today. Really appreciative of everybody taking some time. I'm excited to host this webinar, sort of talking about quality of hire and Crosschq's recently published Q report. For those of you that I do not know, my name is Mike Fitzsimmons. I am the CEO of Crosschq, and I'll be hosting today's session. And this is not a sales pitch for Crosschq, but just a little bit of background on the company. We are a data and analytics platform that's sole purpose in the world is to help companies both measure and optimize quality of hire. We currently work with about 450 different customers across all sectors. We've touched 20 million hiring decisions over the last several years. And today is an exciting opportunity for us to talk a little bit about some of the insights we have and some of our esteemed colleagues. And kind of what their interpretation of some of this data is. So with that, I wanted to do quick introductions to our panelists. We'll start with Whitney Bryant, and then we can go sort of round the room to Tim and then Amber, and we'll kind of walk through and then dive into the webinar. So thanks again for joining.
Great, thanks, Mike. Happy to be here. Whitney Bryant from Dish Network. I am the recruiting operations manager here. Been with Dish within the HR space with about 4 years now.
Awesome. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, everybody. Tim Sackett. I own and run a recruiting company out of Michigan that does tech recruiting, but I also have been writing every single day in the space for about 10, 12 years. Have a book called The Talent Fix, podcast called HR Famous, which is kind of tongue in cheek because people say, oh, you must be famous if you have a podcast. I'm like, no, I'm HR famous. There's like 13 HR people that know me. That's what I am.
Well, Tim, the output, your daily output is welcome. It's amazing that you keep that up. So good on you.
I'm Amber West. I'm a psychologist here at Crosschq, and I am a former people analytics practitioner. So have a data analytics background. I am also from Michigan. So Michigan representing here.
Go green.
All right, awesome. So sort of to get us going here, I wanted to level set on, frankly, why we think the timing is right for this conversation. And I think, Crosschq is headquartered out in Silicon Valley, so we're really close to everything that's happening in the tech market. I think over 900 companies in the tech sector alone have had layoffs this year. It feels like a daily occurrence that we're reading about them. But unemployment continues to be low. We have 10 million open jobs in the US, all these mixed signals. There's a lot to kind of uncover on this quality of hire topic. And I think now's the time kind of to do it. I reflect on a quote that the CEO of Uber made earlier this year when he said that hiring is now a privilege. And I kind of wanted to start this, Tim, throw it to you on, from your analyst seat, do you think there's been a shift in the market and is hiring more of a privilege than it was before?
Yeah, it's funny because I heard a stat this morning, actually, that if you're 35 or under, you've never been through a downturn in the economy that impacted your career. And people would argue like 08, 09, maybe I was just coming out of college or just starting my career. But the reality is, right, that we have an entire generation that for their most part, they didn't see hiring as a privilege because we hired like drunken sailors, like literally. I think it was Twitter that when they decided to do a layoff with their TA team, they had 1,250 people in TA for 8,000 employees. Like that is the size of a TA team for like a 1 million person company, right? It's those kinds of examples that, that we've really kind of went away from traditional business fundamentals. And I think, like you had mentioned, Silicon Valley really is kind of the precipice for this, is that it wasn't about, traditionally, Mike and Whitney and everybody on the call, like it was about you build a service or a product, you price that so that it pays for the expense of whatever that product or service is, and you have profit and kind of margin within that. And then still, I think the, kind of tech came along and said, oh, no, that doesn't make a difference. Go ahead and just burn through cash. Like it doesn't matter. There'll always be more cash. And then, it's all about growth. It's all about user. It's all about being bigger. And the value of your company then becomes the true value, not anything to do with you're actually making money on the service or, product that you're selling. The problem is like in a downturn, like all of a sudden those business fundamentals actually matter. Like, the people who are investing in you and giving you money want to say, wait a minute, is this actually profitable? So yeah, I want to say like hiring's always been a privilege, but we've forgotten about that for about the last decade,
Yeah, I not to jump in on the Twitter bandwagon, but I saw a really interesting statistic on that when they at 200 million monthly active users, they had 1,000 employees, and at 300 million monthly active users, they had 12,000 employees. It was just the correlation to your point between input and output.
So yeah, and then we, like you said, the jobs thing is kind of like the crazy piece is that we still have 10 million open jobs, and we have about 6 million, kind of unemployed individuals. And even with all the layoffs, that you had mentioned, and I think the layoffs will actually get worse in 2023. But for me, this is really, it's almost, I heard another person call it a Patagonia vest recession. It's going to hit the tech sector really hard. It's going to hit some white collar folks really hard. But like when we take a look at people who are doing high volume hourly hiring, manufacturing, hospitality, restaurants, all of this, those people are still going to have a hard time really hiring over the next few years because demographically in the US, we don't have enough humans for the jobs that we have open. And that becomes one of those issues where we go, look, quality of hire is still going to matter in a really major way, even on both sides, right? If I have to hire a lot, quality of hire is going to matter. But if I also go back to that Uber quote, if that becomes a privilege and I can only hire a few, well, then the quality of hire thing becomes exponentially more important.
Yeah, so Whitney, let's go to you. I know Dish has been rapidly growing, and with the investments in the wireless initiative, has there been any shift in the mentality over the last couple of years or last few quarters? Anything, any insights you can give us in terms of what you were seeing?
Yeah, so there's definitely been a shift. It's been interesting and exciting at the same time. So, we have our traditional metrics that we're looking for, but there's been a huge push for quality, right? Because every seat matters, every person matters. And so being able to figure out what that formula and that secret sauce is has been a big focus. And so for us over the past year after we've launched the quality of hire survey with you all, we've really been focusing on how can we actually bring that to life? How can we actually start making that actionable while we are still growing in this market where some companies maybe have to readjust headcount? We actually have to expand and grow. And so understanding how do we determine performance is really key for us. So really digging in, analyzing that work and bringing more awareness, but it's a consistent drive. It's a consistent message across the board with our leadership team that, hey, we got to figure out how to get quality talent in and get it in right and doing it right the first time.
That's awesome. All right, and Amber, last one on this kind of macro perspective. You're the dual threat as an IO and someone who talks to customers every day. Are you hearing different messages from all the companies that you're speaking with in terms of this shift from quantity to quality?
I think it's pretty consistent across the board. I was on a customer call the other day, and one of the metrics that we can add to a dashboard is time to fill. And they were like, we don't care about that. We would never put that on a dashboard. That's not a metric that we're tracking right now. And I'm just hearing a lot of that. Yeah, I was like, oh, yay, okay, we can move that conversation along. And I'm also one of the big kind of macro changes that I've seen in the time I've been, working on quality of hire. I would say I started my first foray into quality of hire was when I was an intern in grad school, and it was an HR problem. And the conversation is shifting to talent acquisition now. And the wall between TA and HR is starting to be broken down across multiple organizations. So that's been exciting to see that shift.
Awesome. All right, let's dive into the report itself, the Crosschq Q report. And for those of you on the call that do not have access to this, I think Deb's going to give share a link with it so you can get access. But just to kind of recap what I mentioned earlier, Crosschq is in this business of helping companies both measure and optimize quality of hire. We have hundreds of customers. We touch millions of hiring decisions. And what motivated us to put together this Q report was really this idea that, gosh, if we're going to catalyze the conversation around quality of hire, and to Amber's point, this sort of nebulous metric that's hung out somewhere between HR and TA and even business units, we want to stand up and sort of lead the dialogue. So that was really the inspiration for our Q report. And that's something for those of you that have not seen it, you hopefully will see it, and then we'll be publishing those quarterly with updates and radical insights. But with that, I did want to kind of, before we kind of dive into the science, sort of share one visual that sort of shows you at Crosschq how we think about this conversation. And I think it also sets up for the data we're going to review. Whitney kind of mentioned where Dish is on their talent intelligence curve, maturity curve, and I think they're pretty far along, relatively speaking. But this is really how we start so many conversations. And we know most companies are on the left side of this curve, right? Which means that they are sort of still struggling with what metrics matter to me, how do I think about the difference, or focusing on traditional recruiting KPIs like time to fill. How do I actually move my organization into a world where I am focused around quality of hire and that sort of thing? So we really start here. We know that companies are handcuffed by access to data. We know that traditional behaviors and metrics and KPIs that are much more operational just lead us to the left side of that graph. But really what we want to push today and push the envelope on the conversation today is how do we actually move the industry and move our companies along this maturity curve. So a big part of that is this idea of connecting our hiring decisions with business outcomes, right? And that's really what drives quality of hire, is this idea of getting pre-hire candidate intelligence and mapping that with post-hire outcomes. So with that, I want to throw it back to Amber to take you all through a little bit of the science of how Crosschq operates, especially in the right side of this graph, where we're actually connecting the business outcomes with the hiring decisions, and then we will dive into the report and get into the meat of the data. So Amber, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I would say when you hear quality of hire, people often define this very differently. I would say just think of this as the most general definition is the value that new hires bring to an organization with, by combining the most important measures of workplace success into a single metric. So what that means more specifically is that it's unique to your organization, and you as an organization define what quality means, which is essentially you determine what outcomes that you want to include in the algorithm and the calculation. So what we're seeing is this visualization of our approach to solving this unique, complex problem for multiple different organizations. Some organizations are going to come to us and they are going to have multiple data sources, and they're going to be able to check many of these pre-hire and post-hire data boxes that you're seeing here. And this is a sampling. Some are going to come to us and have very minimal and be in the very beginning of their journey, and we can meet that need as well. So really the point is it's unique to you. We know that, we understand that, and we want it to be unique to you. When we're talking of, what are we measuring? We're measuring, these data points are all at the individual level. So it's employee level data, which is important because then you can roll it up and get insights, not just at an individual level, but at a team level, department level, hiring manager level, to be able to look at all the people under them. So you can really cut the data to answer questions that the organization cares about and that they're asking. And then I would just say, in terms of the Q report and what we're going to talk about for the rest of the day, it is real data. This isn't made up data. Just to answer any questions out there relating to that, it's a sample size of over 40,000 employee records, and we have the sampling cut across businesses that vary in sizes and verticals and worker types. So hourly, salary, warehouse, remote. It is truly a representative sample that we found these findings from. This isn't made up data or purely like marketing data. It is real, actual data that pulls into both, performance, retention is kind of the key universal metrics for all organizations for quality of hire. So know that that's mostly what we were looking at in this report as well.
All right, let's get jamming here. So thank you, thanks for that, Amber. So the goal here is we've got sort of 5 key data points we want to talk about, and we're going to go through and go kind of around the group and give some insight on them. The first one that I wanted to start with was sort of the baseline QOH metrics. We published in the report that the average quality of hire for all companies studied was 73. what we observed in this is that the quality of hire scores were actually correlated to that curve that I showed a moment ago. It was one of those things that companies that aren't measuring aren't really optimizing, as simple as that might seem. So with that, I want to start with Whitney. And as a company that has a quality of hire, frankly, well above the mean and is continuing to move along that curve, would love just to hear a bit about the journey at Dish. Just how did you begin? Who drove it functionally in the organization? And maybe even talk a little bit about your tool stack and some of the other details about a day in the life of Dish, who really is, I would claim, a company that's highly focused on this quality of hire concept.
Yeah, sure. So the journey for us began about 1.5 years ago, working with the Crosschq team, really digging into survey data, et cetera. But ultimately, when we look at the decision to begin that journey, it was, I think, a mutual decision, right? So from the business standpoint, I know that it's probably not foreign to us, but we hear, hey, we want to get somebody hired tomorrow. We're like, okay, well, we want them to be a quality hire, so then they're going to be here for a long time. And so then we have this really interesting dynamic where we're trying to appease the speed of process, but also ensuring quality. And so when we think about quality of hire and driving that from the business standpoint, as well as recruiting, it was kind of a mutual decision, which has definitely helped with when you think about adoption of the process, reinforcing best practices with our leadership team to make sure they're completing those surveys in a timely manner to get us that metric. But ultimately, it was a dual decision that we've been working hand in hand with. But when we think about where we have been from over a year, we are at 85% for our quality of hire score. And we're very excited about that, but it's something that has come a long way. We've had ebbs and flows, we've had ups and downs, but it's been really dedicated to a lot of data analysts consistently on a monthly basis, not only with the Crosschq account team, but also internally, right? We had to understand the data to then be able to articulate it to our business partners, to then be able to start looking at it from a trend standpoint, to then ultimately start proposing process enhancement changes that we're hoping to start implementing next year. But it's definitely been an ongoing process. It's not, a one-time review and that's it. It's a continual deep dive of the data. We have a dedicated data analyst that focuses on this work as well. And it's actually a larger level OKR for us on an HR strategic strategy. So it's a key focus point, and bringing the business along and bringing our stakeholders along has really helped us with growing and hopefully continue to improving our quality of hire.
I love that you've established it as an OKR. And that is one of the things that with this conversation around quality of hire, it's like everyone talks about it and says, yeah, we care. But then, as we said earlier, the day in the life is like, no, I got to fill butts and seats, and that's what I have to do today. So that's really, really cool. The business partner buy-in, is there any insight you can give us on what that journey has been like? So for those of us that are trying to figure out how to navigate that.
Yeah, so we are a very data-driven company, so definitely leading with data before we implemented, but being able to show what the value add would be with understanding quality, but also being able to provide their own feedback back to them. Like, hey, this is what you're looking for. Well, this is how we're going to be able to achieve that. And we have this great metric as well as additional reports that will be able to articulate and bring to life what you're asking for. So for us, it's really providing the with them, right? What's in it for me from a business standpoint as you're building that buy-in. But for us, for selling it, it was, an easy sell because they needed what we were selling, and it just, worked well when we were, pitching the idea around quality of hire and also making it a strategic goal for the business.
Hey, Mike, can I go off script? Can I ask Whitney a question? So Whitney, I'm so interested in this conversation. I want to know, like, when you started tracking quality of hire, did you do it by hiring manager, by team, by group function, whatever that might be? And did you see certain ones that were like, they just constantly have a lower quality of hire, and how do we help them? What do we do to kind of support them? I'm just wondering how that looks.
Yeah, great question. So we started out with just department data. And so as Amber was mentioning about and sending over our internal data, that was probably step B after we realized, man, we actually can really delineate this data to be able to dig in more beyond department. And so we track our results by department, by hiring manager, by candidate type for hiring, sourcing. So all really key KPIs for us. So to your question, Tim, we are able to identify, hey, these are the lower performance numbers, and we're actually going back to the business to be able to say, hey, what's going on? Where can we improve for process? And all of that information where we are right now is really going to be a great stepping stool for 2023, because we now are able to take that feedback, take that analysis, and drive process improvements. One of the areas we're going to lead off with is our interview process. And we're now able to look at department and hiring managers and even recruiters to be able to say, where are some gaps here and where can we start upscaling, where the opportunity is there.
Love that.
Awesome. And Whitney, before we move forward to some other data insights, just in terms of your tool stack, I know that was something we talked about in the prep, just for I know so many companies have I think the average is 12 tools in their TA stack alone right now. I'm just curious how that looks for you at Dish, and how you kind of got through that challenge of getting the data to talk to each other.
Yeah, so we're right along there with everyone else. We are over-indexed in our tech stack. So something that we're evaluating also. But when we look at our tech stack, we have our core products with the ATS, where we're partnering with ISEMs, but a CRM, a pre-boarding module, and then a lot of add-on enhancement integration, such as questionnaires, reference check, background check, et cetera. But we definitely are heavily indexed. But what's interesting about bringing in a quality of hire metric now, we can potentially start looking at efficiency metrics as well as potentially an indicator for ROI. And so for me, from an operational lens, I'm excited. So then I can kind of figure out, hey, do we need to skim or trim the fat a little bit, or what can we do here? But we're really excited about it, but more to come.
Awesome. All right, so let's hop into our first kind of real insight out of the report, and this was around interview scores. And I know you just kind of led us to this, and that was great. But the study found that there was only a 9% correlation between interview scores and ultimately quality hires. And one of the things that jumped out at us was that 76% of interviewers were only doing one interview per year. Which sort of explained part of it. We sort of realized that, gosh, we're trusting folks to help inform talent decisions who aren't necessarily experts at getting the data that's going to be used to inform. So with that one, Tim, I want to throw to you and get your reaction in terms of that theme, and does it surprise you, and any other thoughts?
No, I don't think it does. I think it's I hear this from TA leaders and CHROs all the time. We're like, oh, we need interview training. And I'm like, yeah, that's great, except it's a one time a year, or maybe you even do kind of an ongoing kind of lunch and learn, whatever. But for that person who doesn't interview, they might have training in January, they don't interview until August. They're never going to remember that. They're never going to be able to practice that. So they're not going to be very predictive and good at what they do. So I think it's for us as TA leaders, we have to determine, how do we restructure interviewing to make sure we have somebody who is really good and predictive, along with somebody who maybe doesn't get the chance to do a lot of that. And maybe it's hey, you don't get to interview a lot for your team, but we're going to throw you on some panels throughout the year to keep that kind of sharpen that saw and keep that thing sharp, and have them work on it, or vice versa, of having somebody that interviews a lot, even though I know there's a capacity issue there, to work with someone who doesn't when they have to interview, to kind of help prop them up. Because I think we have to figure out a way to help them in training is one thing, but unless you're going to do ongoing training all year long, nonstop, year after year, you just can never really give them the practice they need.
Yeah, one of the other insights that we found was that, and this is a big number it seems, but that the cohort that was doing 12 or more interviews a year was highly predictive, right? Yeah. So there was a skill there for sure. And I know, Amber, your perspective on this insight.
Yeah. So from scientific IO psychology perspective, it's been well known for a long time that structured interviewing is one of the most effective tools in a selection process. But the inherent problem with structured interviewing is that it requires humans to follow a script, and humans go off script. It's you're 100% always going to want to go off script. And best, and you have this intuition, and you want to derail. So that's the inherent flaw with it. And then the other problem that I just see is creating good structured interviewing is a huge undertaking because it really should be role specific. So if you're talking about an enterprise organization that is hiring 10,000 people a year, and maybe that covers, even if it only covers 5,000 roles, that's 5,000 structured interview questionnaires. And that's just a huge undertaking for an organization to do incredibly well.
So Whitney, you mentioned a little bit on the prior piece about you guys are optimizing some of it, and interviews is one of the places you're pointing your efforts. Is there anything just kind of headline level you can give us in terms of strategies and what you all are doing?
Yeah, we're thinking of competency-based interviewing. So we're really trying to group it at a higher level than to the call out on both Amber and Tim's side, being able to identify a one-off experience by role. So if we can group it at a higher level, then hopefully the consistency of the same questions being asked on a consistent basis will impact and improve the quality of what we're building out from our interviewing standpoint.
That's
It's
great.
the thought. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, hey, look, at least now you have the data to help you realize if it's going to be working or not, which I think is
it's so hard because we want our hiring managers to own talent, right? We want them to be a part of that TA process, the selection process, the sourcing process, obviously. But there's also a piece where you go, gosh, if we could just train a group of professional interviewers in our company that we know would be consistent, that would be great. They would probably produce a higher quality of hire over and over and over again, much better than all these hiring managers. But can you imagine being a hiring manager and all of a sudden someone goes, hey, here's Tim, congratulations, he's yours. You'd be like, I didn't choose Tim, you know.
I love it. All right, cool. Let's keep jamming here. So the next thing we wanted to talk about, this one was really controversial, and our eyes kind of popped when we saw this. But our second insight was around sort of the correlation of candidate assessments to quality of hire. And I think we looked at 10 different assessments and found that 6 of them were actually not predictive of quality of hire. And one of them that is a very well-known assessment, 92% of the top performers it predicted were actually in the lowest decile of performers post-hire, right? So we're like, oh my gosh, this is scary stuff. So Amber, I want to put back to you on this from the IO perspective, because I know you've studied assessments for a big part of your career, and then we'll kind of come to Tim on it. But what's your take on this one?
So unfortunately, not super surprising. I have built assessments. I have worked at companies that build assessments and implement assessments. As an internal HR practitioner in my past, I implemented an assessment that we selected and saw it fail. I think the number one kind of headline here is just that assessments often don't change as quick as your business does. So a true validation study for an assessment is a pretty big undertaking for the assessment provider and the organization. You have to pull a lot of data, or you have to ask for a lot of resources from your employees, and it takes away from time from work to really do a true validation study, and it's expensive. So that's one reason why assessments kind of get stale within an organization, is the return doesn't always feel like it's worth it. You've already implemented it, it's concrete, it's like embedded in your process, and it just is what you've always done, and you just continue to go with status quo, I think is kind of the thing that happens here. If the data isn't at your fingertips for you to be able to see without a huge lift whether or not it's working, you're probably not going to invest in finding out if it's working, because you don't want to know if you're wasting your money, especially if you're the one who made the decision to purchase the assessment. You really don't want to know if you're wasting the money.
Yeah, Mike, I think assessments are akin to witchcraft in our industry, right? And again, I'm talking about probably not modern, like, some of the modern ones that have been built over the last probably 5 years or so, but like some of the traditional personality-based assessments, to me, I mean, the reason that they worked was statistics, right? Because we did something consistently over a long period of time, and you followed that consistency, you were going to have a better result, even if it didn't really necessarily correlate to quality. You were just being consistent. Bailey asked a question about, are we talking about take-home assignments or like the kind of quiz personality things? I think the job sample is completely different than an assessment, right? Job sample has a high correlation to quality. It's so hard to pull off and so expensive. Many companies just don't do it. A coding test would be something like that, right? from that standpoint. These are more of the personality type assessments that claim to have and produce a high quality of hire, which I don't think they really do on a consistent basis. But
akin to witchcraft. I think we need to put that in quotes. That might be the executive.
I'm sure the assessment industry loves me right now. Yeah.
Yeah, your phone's ringing off the hook for sure. All right, very cool. And I think the other thing to chime in on there is the candidate experience side, right? So I think they're not great from a candidate experience perspective in many cases, and they take time and they alienate our talent a little bit. So there's a lot to unpack there. But again, the same theme of you can't fix it unless you measure it. So it's starting to get some visibility into it, I think, is the takeaway here. All right, we're gonna have some fun with this one. This was one that just sort of again jumped out at us around internal referral programs. And just to be clear, this is not talking about internal mobility. This is literally talking about sort of in most cases incentivized referral programs. And we found that in most cases these programs are underperforming from a quality of hire perspective, coming in as low as 26% below the mean for many companies. I want to throw this to Whitney to start, because I know you don't have this problem, which is awesome. And I do want to reiterate that I think that this isn't the data we're providing is across a wide swath of customers and company types and that sort of thing. So it's good that we have those that are doing it right and some that maybe have opportunities to do it differently or better. But with that, Whitney, why do you think it works at Dish, and any other insights you have on this one?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna hopefully assign it to our outreach and engagement campaign internally. But when I think about the results that we're seeing for quality of hire, I think it's exciting because we are a really culture first, we have a culture first mentality. And so that's really ingrained into our DNA, and we look for that regarding hires. And so when we think about the correlation between bringing in new hires based off of referrals, to me, it shows that it's working, right? It shows that our messaging is working, and we're able to also capture that within our pre-hire surveys, where we do include culture questions to tie that into the post-hire survey. So for us, I think it's a testament to our engagement campaigns internally, but it just shows that it's working, and we're bringing in the type of talent that we would want to bring in based off of a culture first mindset.
Is your program, is it incentive based? Is there cash incentive, or what's the setup?
There is. So we have 4 different tier payouts based off of level. So it is incentivized. We have done a revamp and review of our incentive policy to ensure that it's aligned with the market expectations. So it was something that we did really drill into to make sure that it was something that we can get engagement from our employee base. And it seems to be working, and people are actively engaged, posting about it, et cetera.
I'm curious, with the market shifts over the last few quarters, have you seen any increase in activity or volume, or is it pretty steady? Any?
We have seen quite a bit of increase, especially when we think about our wireless build out and the opportunities there with net new roles. So it has been interesting to see multiple people applying to multiple roles, which is great. But we are seeing that increase in uptick within that space.
Yeah.
Whitney, does Dish have a target of how many referral hires a year you want to do in terms of percentage of overall hiring?
Yeah, so our goal is 15% of our hires for
1.5, not 50, right?
Oh, no, 15.
Yeah. I was like, wow, 50 is great. Wow.
I mean, man, you tell me how to do that. No. But 15% is.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think a lot of people on the webcast they always want to know. They feel like, gosh, we're at this number. Does it feel good? Do we need more or less? And I think it's always good for us to share kind of that benchmarking of kind of where we're trying to get to.
Yes.
Tim, and HRT, when we talked about this one, I remember this was the one you're like, oh my goodness, jumped off the page at you.
It destroys an industry norm, right? Forever, for decades, we've said, you do employee referrals. And why do we like to hire employee referrals? Because they're always a higher quality and they're cheaper and everything else. And it was under this kind of notion, it's really a belief more than it is data driven, of, well, if I'm an employee and I work for you, Mike, and I refer somebody, I would never put my job or my reputation at risk. And so I'd always get to refer somebody good. Turns out we don't know if our friends and our family are actually good workers or not. No. We just like them, right? I mean, the ones that we would refer, we like. The ones we don't like, we don't refer. They actually might be good workers. We don't know. But I think it's one of those crazy things that that mentality or that belief like drove an entire industry for so long. And then your data, which again is statistically relevant, I think blows up that concept of that. Now, again, there's always going to be companies that like do a better job with that. And I think they have strong cultures, right, around who they will. I think the reason that this number comes out at like 26% below the mean is that so often hiring managers feel a huge pressure to actually hire that referral because they have to look at the person on their team, or everybody's emailing them, what about this referral? What's happening here? And they just feel pressure. And so sometimes like you're going to hire somebody that might be less quality, but you just don't want to have to share with maybe somebody on your team that you value, that's a high performer, to say, hey, you know what? Your, best friend that you referred is a piece of garbage, right? Like, because then you blow them out of the water and, and so you just go, okay, well, whatever, we'll hire,
Hey, Whitney, at Dish, is the selection process different at all for the candidate if they come in through a referral program versus, from another source?
It's the same. So they'll go through the same process.
Yes, because Tim, we are seeing that with a lot of companies where it's not the same. Like they do skip a couple of steps, right?
Yep.
In terms of both the number of interviews that they do, and frankly, whether they do, there's some.
Mike, that's pretty. In most companies, like those referrals automatically get pushed to the top of the stack or whatever, and that does cause an issue, right, to hiring managers feeling like they have to do these interviews and they have to hire, otherwise somebody's going to come knocking on their door from HR asking why,
Yeah. Amber, I want to throw to you because you have some real world examples as well from other clients of ours, and
Yeah, and I think relevant to like what Whitney and Tim have been talking about, it's all about referral bias. Like that is what is wrapped up in all of what the conversation has been around referral bias. And Whitney, her situation is likely different because they've worked hard to mitigate that internally, even if without knowing if that's what they were doing, having the same process and having like very clear outreach and engagement around this. And I think a lot of organizations just kind of skip those steps of being really thoughtful about it. And they focus on the incentivized component, and then they just trust that people will refer good people because their credibility is on the line. But it's really, we have a customer who looked at their referral program, and they actually found that those referrals were not the highest quality. So they revamped the referral program, and their revamping of it, one of the key components was removing the monetization of it. And then they looked at the change that resulted in, and the quality of referrals went up dramatically when there was no monetary incentive for people to refer, and it was all about your credibility and your reputation. So for them, that worked. And maybe I don't know if they lowered volume of referrals, but the quality increased. So one could argue if volume went down, that's not so significant if quality truly did increase.
Amber, I'm interested to see, like, I would love to see one of them test, instead of paying for the end outcome, which is the hire, that you incentivize or you compensate or you reward for the behaviors that lead to the hire, right? Like if I'm Whitney and I'm like going out to a team, I'm like, look, all I need is the name in the email, or the name and the cell phone number of somebody you think is good for this job. And then we'll go through our process, right? And if you give me that, we're going to give you X reward or whatever. And if they show up for the interview, we decide that they're good enough for an interview, we'll reward that. If they show up first day at work, that, like they don't ghost us, like, okay, we'll reward that. But but then if you don't reward for like, 90 days after hire, year after hire, blah, blah, it becomes like this monopoly money kind of thing. I'm wondering if that would even change. If you're just rewarding for the behaviors that lead versus the outcome. I don't know, but we see teams that have increased their referral hires exponentially by eliminating the outcome and paying for the behavior, right, that led to it.
Yeah.
Love it. All right, well, that's a fun one, and we'll move on. But I know we could probably sit on that topic for the rest of the time here. So let's move on. So what are the other ones that and thankfully, Whitney, for you guys at Dish have not had to deal with this, but for those 900 plus companies that I talked about at the outset that have gone through some layoffs, here in 2022, our sample size showed us that, gosh, in many cases, companies were actually letting go of some real high performers, and the process by which we're making reduction in force decisions, we seem to observe quite a bit of bias, some last in, first out bias, bias around how compensation is connected to those decisions versus real quality and output. But I think the numbers were something like we were laying off folks with 15% higher quality than those that we were keeping. We're like, oh my goodness, how is this actually happening? I had one talent CPO that when he saw the data and they'd gone through actually 2 layoffs, he said, please don't share this with my CEO. I was like, I won't. but interview you a little bit on this, like, how the heck did we get here? Right.
I think this is another kind of very traditional behavior in HR and TA, which is seniority matters when it comes to layoff. Even though we tend to say, "Oh no, look at your best performers." It's if I'm a hiring manager and I have 2 people and I have to choose between, and one's been here 3 years and one has been here 7 years, it's a really difficult conversation for me to have with the one. To tell the 7-year employee you're getting laid off and the 3-year employee staying, right? And so there's all kinds of those kinds of things that are happening where we still tend to, like, all things being close, not equal, but close, we tend to go the seniority route, or, this person's been here longer, earned it, whatever. So I'd love to see really to dig into that data, and like Amber, to see by length of employee, right? Do we start to see a little bit of that lifetime value of an employee start to decrease? Thus, because of the seniority factor, we're keeping a lower quality of person over somebody who's been there a little less, or whatever that might be. I think, like you said, like Mark, I think CEOs and C-suites really need to see this and go, wait a minute, there has to be a better way, especially. And again, I don't think, just because we're going through a recession, like if we take a look at the annual amount of layoffs that happen, 2022 is going to be on average to a normal year. Now, again, 2020, 2021 were different years because of the pandemic, but overall it's not crazy. I think people think 2023 will be a little bit higher, but every company lays off. I work with GM. GM's a great example. They had a massive layoff and people were like, oh, there goes the traditional auto industry. Look, no, there's a massive transition from combustion engine to electric engine. They don't need mechanical engineers, they need electrical and software engineers, right? And so you have this kind of ebb and flow with your staff that happens over time. I think even like Whitney with you and Dish, you guys have gone through this digital transformation to streaming, you're going through this growth phase right now of having to bring in certain kinds of individuals that you might have not needed before, right?
Yeah, it is. Tim, also one of the points you brought up, and we're working on for our next study, a deeper dive on compensation and the correlation to quality of hire, right? It seems like such a simple question, but it is, if I spend more, do I get more, kind of a thing, right? And that's part of it too, is you actually see we're salary hunting in many of these risks. We actually prefer to let go of one larger salary than 2 smaller salaries, right? Because the human element of that, but the logic is that you made that investment in the first place on the larger salary because they're going to drive.
We have a lot of TA leaders on the webcast, and I always think that there's a ceiling for a recruiter salary in production, right? And we always keep thinking, oh, well, the better recruiter should make so much more. And I'm thinking, I'm in Michigan, so you have to put this with a grain of salt, because the average recruiter salary here might be $80,000 or $75,000 or whatever. Many times when I was in that corporate TA leadership role, my 65 to 85 recruiters were as good as somebody that I was paying 85 to 120, and sometimes even better, right? And it's it became this thing where year after year, they just kept getting more and more and more. But there's kind of a ceiling of what you can expect a recruiter to actually accomplish. There's only so much capacity that recruiter has. And if they're all, producing at a fairly high level, then there's a point where it doesn't make sense for me to pay more,
Yeah, and there's a bleed in on this one. We don't want to cross the line into the other side completely, but I will tell you one other dynamic that was subtle that we learned in just talking to more talent leaders, gosh, how did this happen? It was sort of around secrecy, And it was around, gosh, when you're doing these things, we try to keep it so tight in the company and don't take it beyond a certain level. Maybe it's a C-suite conversation, maybe it's one level down, and so we can't really go start pulling an ad hoc request for the data to actually do this in the right way. Right now, obviously, like Whitney and Tish, you all now have a system and you'll have all that data on demand. You don't have to sort of start that. But if you're not here on that talent intelligence curve and you're faced with one of these, right, and you're trying to protect, right, protect the fact that this is happening from other employees in the company, all that stuff, it just creates this perfect storm. And again, what we've seen is like spreadsheet on the leaders table, give me $5 million, right, and give me 50 names, kind of a thing, right? And it just seems like that behavior has unfortunately become more of the norm than we would have liked. So I don't know, Whitney or Amber, anything on this topic you guys want to hit? I know it wasn't on the script, but any ads? All right. All right, cool. Let's keep jamming. So those were it. Those were kind of the five, the headline insight and the four that we thought were pretty interesting, kind of radical insights around interviewing, around referrals, around layoffs. And I think that just there's a lot to learn here. And I think we'll reiterate the fact that just getting the data is the first part of the journey. I think I want to shift gears a little, Whitney, start with you on sort of outlook for 2023. Just you had mentioned moving to more operationalizing now, but just broadly kind of what you guys are seeing and how you think that data can help.
Yeah, so I know I mentioned already about interviewing as an area of focus where we're going to start putting that into practice, but also, going through like a time and process analysis and being able to really dig in there to then start making those incremental updates based off of the different factors that we are identifying within our report. So if we are identifying lower performer recruiters, maybe we need to look at their full end-to-end process and figure out maybe they have higher fallout here, or maybe it takes them longer to transition candidates to this status to that status. So really actually getting into the weeds of the end-to-end process is what we're going to focus on with being able to use that data. So we're really excited. I know you mentioned just a little bit ago, Mike, about baselining. Like that's all we've been doing. We've been baselining. We've been trying to figure out where do we begin. And we're at a point now where we feel good to move forward and really start making those strategic process changes.
Whitney,
So
it's super.
Yeah, go, Tim.
Yeah, I know. I think it's a super important thing you just pointed out is like so often we don't establish those baselines in first and know where that benchmark needs to be before we can actually improve it. And I think it's really wise to go out and say, hey, let's give us a period of time just to measure what we're currently doing the way we're doing it, and then make change and see actually what happens in measuring the exact same thing. So often we just go, nope, we're just going to start doing something. Then we go, oh, look what happened. And you're like, you don't know if that's better or worse,
Great. Well, and I think it's interesting because even thinking about the formula for quality of hire, to Amber, one of your earlier comments about how you own that formula, right? What formula works for Dish is not going to be the same for another company. And so with that baselining, we had to understand how do we define quality of hire? And we've gotten to a point where we've been able to figure out those different variables that we're really focused on and the weights, et cetera. So we're excited. We're ready to go.
That's
great.
great.
Tim, to your point too, on the journey of like the baseline and yeah, and Whitney, to your point, I remember one of the first visualizations we published was because we were just all excited. We have this great data, and the tool was the quality of hire by the recruiter. And we're our customers are TA, right? And they're like, we're not ready for that.
Don't show that. Yeah.
So anyway, it is all part of the journey. Well, and with that, so Tim, I want to fire back to you in terms of a little bit of 23 outlook. And
yeah,
you made the comment earlier on time to fill and that sort of thing. But do you think we're knocking on the door of sort of industry-wide shift around, how we measure success in talent acquisition?
Hey, someday I'm going to be retired, sitting on a beach in Cayman. And if I will only feel satisfied in my career with success if we no longer use time to fill as a metric in TA. There is literally zero correlation to success in talent acquisition and days to fill. I will tell people even now, it's because I think everyone uses it, right? So I don't want to I'm not trying to make fun of anybody that uses it corporately. I think to me, it's a health metric, right? If you're hiring for a certain subset of whatever, and you're in the industry average or market average is 37 days time to fill. and you're at 85, well, you have cancer. There's a problem in your organization. But if it's 37 and you're at 37.5, you're fine. There's no reason to focus on that. If you're at 39, there's no reason. If you're at 34, there's no reason. I just think it's one of those things that really doesn't lend us to give us any kind of insight at all to if we're being successful or not. Unlike, the quality of hire or other kind of funnel metrics and correlations to, like screens to interviews to hires and all these other things that have a much better like success ratio.
And as much as your passion is around that, and we don't know when you're retired and when you're in Cayman, are you seeing your talent leaders that you work with sort of starting to ask those questions more? Is that a reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing, it's really funny because I think you guys have really started on the forefront of really trying to figure out analytics for recruiters and recruiter success. I always wondered why the ATSs don't do this. And when I talk, and again, I was at iSIMS a few weeks ago. I've been to Greenhouse Open. I mean, all these ATSs, Workday Rising. They go, look, they're not asking for it. And I'm like, what do you mean? Who's not asking for it? And they're like, the leaders aren't asking for it. And you're like, really? They're not asking for like hard measures about success of their function and their individuals. And I think that's, again, a traditional kind of HR mentality of, we don't really want hard black and white measures of success, because then we feel like then people can actually measure if we're being successful or not. Right now, it's a little nebulous, right? The days to fill can be, moved around enough. I can close a long-term rec, and all of a sudden at the end of the year, I'm like, yeah, we made our goal. We dropped from 37 to 36.9. We all get bonus. And you're like, come on, man, that's not real. That doesn't show anything. So yeah, I do. I think the TA leaders that I work with right now and the CHROs are finally starting to understand they have to have hard business numbers. They really need these. But like the question they still have is, well, what are those, right? How do we measure for quality of hire? How do we, get these funnel metrics that we need on an ongoing basis without like blowing up our entire stack and starting over,
All right, cool. So that we got a couple of questions we wanted to hit in the Q&A, but that is that kind of wraps the formal part of the presentation. So thank you all for your insights, and hopefully this has been valuable so far for the audience. We just had a couple here. The first one, thinking about quality of hire, do we think that companies will also look to measure ramp time? And maybe I throw that to you, Whitney, in terms of your cocktail. As you said, you've been playing with it. Have you started to think about ramp time for different roles and how that impacts?
We haven't really gone down that path to look at ramp time, to be honest. But I think it's a good call out. But it hasn't been something that we've been reviewing.
There's a chart of, you can Google like employee lifetime value, and there's like a little diagram that's out there that kind of shows like the traditional employee value, and then how a great ramp up time can actually increase that value over time, longer period. And I think it's a great visual for people to understand, like, why is like a great onboarding and training, to get somebody up to speed so important. Sorry, I talked right over you, like which is kind of normal, Amber. Sorry.
That's okay. I was going to bring up the same metric, employee lifetime value. I think is a really important metric. And I am seeing, I think ramp time in sales roles has always been an area of focus, right? But I am seeing more customers have curiosity around this and looking at this and using like early in the new hires tenure pulsing at like month 1, month 2, month 3. So you can get an early pulse on how are they ramping over time, and you can see the trend over time. And you could, if there's a trend for a certain hiring manager where they're ramping their people a lot faster than their peers, if you have monthly data from a pulse survey, you can see that, and then you can really be able to take that strategic action within. So you can set your baseline, as Whitney was saying, and then you can digest that and see where you are, and then you can take action to address if there are ramp issues. I just think it's this thing that it's always subjective, unless it's a role where you have objective data, like a sales role. It's really easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, we're seeing this in the high volume side too, and we have one customer that's has their warehouses all across, and much like Amazon struggles with quick quits and early retention. And one of those, to this point exactly, one of the data points was it's 11 days to get ROI positive for that hire. They have 3 days of training, they have their costs to get them, and it's 11 days. And they're actually asking us to start pulsing daily.
Yeah.
Think about,
How do we get it to 10 to 9? Yeah.
Exactly, to see that, that, so there is a thing here, certainly from a model perspective to whoever asked the question. It is something we do take into consideration. We understand that there is a nuance that it's going to take, and organizations can adjust that, and they'll have their own.
We did. I work with a manufacturing client that they do machining, and before they would hire somebody like an entry-level machinist, it would take them 3 to 4 weeks to get somebody set up. And they did the augmented reality technology, and now they can get a machinist up to speed in about 3 days because they just keep the goggles on them, and they can. It literally tells them exactly what to do every single thing, and it's seeing what they're doing right or wrong. And it's amazing to see the technology have that kind of impact.
All right, 2 more here. Do you see referral pressure is more on HMs at bigger companies than startups when the referral comes from the CEO and board and they feel pressured?
I think the difference is in a startup, you're closer to that CEO, right? Or that higher level board person, so that there's probably a relationship there and you can push back. You feel like you can push back. Whereas I ran TA for like a 20,000 person health system. And I remember specifically the CEO walking into my office as a leader of TA saying, here's this person was referred. And I had no idea what they were even talking about because it was referred for a job that one of my recruiters had, whatever. And they basically just said they will be hired for this job.
Yeah.
And you go, okay. I mean, I could have pushed back, my recruiter tried to push back, and like the hiring manager tried to push back, but at a certain point you just go, okay, when you're talking about 10, thousands of hires a year, that one hire that the CEO is going to push through, it probably doesn't matter a whole lot. That's what that, it's just, it is what it is. Like Whitney, I would love to know if you've ever gotten that pressure.
Short
You don't need
list.
to tell us.
Right now in Dish, who's the CEO? What's their name? Yeah. Live right now. No.
All right, I'm going to take you off that hot seat, Whitney. Last one here. You mentioned sales is easy to measure because it's quantifiable. Do we see a trend in Eng being pushed to that? So maybe I'll throw that to you, Whitney, in terms of, because you guys are hiring a lot of folks in non-sales roles. How you getting good post-hire data, performance data on other non-sales types of roles?
Yeah, we have our performance appraisal, internal data that we are starting to pull in. To start drawing correlations. And then we also are getting ramped up to launch more post-hire surveys. So we are in the process of starting to pull that information in, but right now it's really tied to our performance appraisal results where we're tying it in.
One thing we've seen on that, the person who asked the question is, there's some catch-all questions too in the early innings when you're working on your curve around rehireability and things of that nature. There's some really simple stuff to hiring manager. Would you rehire XYZ candidate, things of that nature that can just kind of give you some early signal around some of this where it doesn't have to get so perfect. But we are absolutely seeing from an engineering perspective the hyper sophisticated things around not just your point of lines of code written, but also bugs and timeliness of completing projects. There's so much good stuff out there that you can kind of now get your hands on to help drive the machine. So, all right, well, that is us at time. So thank you again to everyone who joined us and for taking time out of your busy days, and Whitney, Tim, Amber, for taking part.
Thanks for having us.
All right, have a great week, everybody. Happy holidays. Bye.
Bye.